Michael Jordan visits his childhood home and breaks down when he sees what's missing. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Michael Jordan had not stepped foot in Wilmington, North Carolina, in decades. The streets were quieter now, with fewer people milling about. The houses on his old street were mostly empty lots, the remnants of a town that had changed, much like he had. It was late afternoon when he arrived, the sun casting long shadows across the road. He parked his car and sat for a moment, looking out at the place that had shaped him, the place that had given him the drive to become who he was. He had returned many times over the years, but this visit was different. He was older now, no longer the relentless force of nature that had defined his basketball career. He had lived a life of unimaginable success, but in the quiet stillness of his childhood home, there was something that tugged at him. There was something missing, something that he hadn't realized had been gone for years. Jordan had spent most of his life running away from his past, chasing greatness, trying to prove something to the world. But now, as he stood on the street where it all began, he couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. There had been moments of triumph, certainly, but there had also been losses that he had never truly allowed himself to feel until now. The place he had once called home had changed. He had changed. And yet, in some ways, he felt like the same person who had left all those years ago. His mind wandered back to the days when he was just a kid, dreaming of greatness. He had been a small-town boy with big ambitions, a chip on his shoulder after being cut from his high school basketball team. It wasn't easy to find the motivation to keep going, but he had found it in the quiet places, in the small moments. He had played basketball in his backyard, in the local parks, anywhere he could find a hoop. It wasn't about fame then, it was about proving something to himself, about fighting for every inch on the court. That was the Michael Jordan that had grown up here, the one who had faced rejection and turned it into fuel for his fire. He remembered his mother's words, how she had always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. His father, too, had been a quiet presence in his life, someone who had shown him the importance of hard work and humility. They were the people who had kept him grounded, who had given him the strength to push through the tough times. And yet, in the years that followed, as his career took off, he had lost sight of those early lessons. The world around him had changed, and with it, his focus. He had become the icon, the legend, the man who could do no wrong. But here, in Wilmington, standing in front of his old house, he realized that something had been lost along the way. The house itself was no longer there. The place where he had grown up, where he had played basketball with his brothers and sisters, was gone, replaced by an empty lot. He couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, not just for the house, but for the innocence of those days. The world had been simpler then. He had been a kid with big dreams, and everything had felt possible. Now, as a man who had achieved everything he had ever set out to do, it all seemed so distant. He thought of the trophies, the endorsements, the championships. They had all come with a price, and standing here, in the place where it had all begun, he realized the cost had been higher than he had imagined. Jordan got out of the car and walked slowly toward the lot where his childhood home once stood. His footsteps were heavy, as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. He looked around, trying to place the memories, to connect the feeling of the place to the man he had become. But it wasn't easy. The street had changed, the neighborhood had changed, and so had he. He stood at the edge of the lot, staring at the empty space. His mind wandered back to the moments that had shaped him, the long hours spent shooting hoops in the driveway, the endless games with his brothers, the way he had always fought for everything he wanted. It was a life defined by struggle and determination, a life that had been molded in this very neighborhood. And now, as he stood there, it felt like those memories were slipping away, like they were becoming a part of the past he could no longer hold on to. His eyes welled up, and for a moment, he let himself feel the weight of it all. The loss, the sacrifices, the relentless pursuit of greatness, it had all led him to this moment. And yet, standing in front of the place where it all began, he realized that the very thing he had been chasing had eluded him all along. He had spent so many years trying to build something that would define his life, to leave a legacy that would never be forgotten. But in the process, he had lost sight of what really mattered: the people, the moments, the things that couldn't be measured by points or championships. Jordan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew that he couldn't change the past, that the house was gone, that the neighborhood was no longer the same. But there was something about being here, standing in this empty space, that made him realize how much he had left behind. He had always been focused on the next thing, the next challenge, the next victory. But now, looking at the empty lot, he understood that there was no next victory that could fill the void. The only thing that mattered was what he had built along the way, the relationships, the lessons, the connections. He turned away from the lot and walked back to his car, feeling a mix of sadness and clarity. There was no going back, no undoing the years that had passed. But there was still time to make things right, to reconnect with the people who had shaped him, to rediscover the things that had given him purpose before the world had defined him. As he drove away from Wilmington, Jordan glanced in the rearview mirror. The town was fading behind him, but the memories were still there, waiting for him to come to terms with them. He wasn't the same person who had left all those years ago. He had grown, changed, and achieved things beyond his wildest dreams. But in that moment, he realized that the greatest journey he had taken was not the one that led him to basketball glory. It was the journey back to the roots of who he was, the journey back to the place that had shaped him. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Michael Jordan felt at peace. The streets of Wilmington began to blur as Michael Jordan drove away from his childhood home, but the emotion stirred by his return lingered in his chest. He had expected the visit to bring clarity, but it had instead left him grappling with a strange sense of nostalgia and loss. The house that had once been the backdrop to his formative years, where he had learned to push himself, to dream big, was gone. It was replaced by an empty lot, the remnants of his past swept away by time and progress. Jordan had spent the past few years immersed in his legacy. He had built an empire, transitioned from basketball to business, and taken on the responsibility of being one of the world's most recognizable athletes. But there, in front of the place where it had all started, the towering figure of Michael Jordan felt small. The house, the place that had held his dreams and his struggles, was now a memory fading into the background of his past. And for the first time, Jordan allowed himself to fully acknowledge that some things would never come back. He turned the car onto the main road and glanced at the town he had left behind. The familiar landmarks, the places he had frequented as a kid, had all changed. The basketball courts he had spent countless hours on were now cracked and overgrown with weeds. The schools had been renovated, the stores he used to walk past were either closed or replaced by new businesses. It felt like a different place, one that no longer recognized the boy who had once dreamed of greatness. Yet, in some strange way, he still felt connected to it. The streets, the trees lining the sidewalks, even the worn-out asphalt of the roads, all of them held memories, memories of a time when basketball had been just a game, when winning wasn't the only thing that mattered. He had never been the best on the court growing up. In fact, he had been overlooked, even rejected. That moment when he had been cut from the high school team had been one of the most pivotal moments of his life, and though it had hurt, it had driven him forward. It had made him who he was. Jordan hadn't realized it at the time, but that rejection had ignited something deep inside him. It pushed him to work harder than ever, to become the player he eventually did. It wasn't just about the game. It was about proving to himself and to everyone around him that he could overcome any obstacle. It was about turning doubt into fuel. And though he had achieved greatness, broken records, and dominated the basketball world, there was still a part of him that wasn't sure he could ever truly let go of that drive, that feeling of inadequacy that had sparked it all. As he continued to drive through Wilmington, Jordan couldn't help but reflect on what he had left behind. The friends from his childhood, the coaches who had believed in him when no one else had, they were all still here, scattered across the town. They had moved on with their lives, but they too carried the imprint of the boy who had dreamed big. He realized how much he had changed, how much he had left behind in his relentless pursuit of perfection. What had once been a small-town dream was now a global reality. But in that reality, some things had been lost along the way. It was hard to articulate the feeling, but there was a profound sense of disconnection between the man he had become and the kid who had shot baskets alone in the driveway. In those early days, it had been about passion, about pushing himself to be the best because that's what the game required. Now, success had become something more complex, something more defined by the expectations of others, by the pressure to maintain an image. He was no longer just Michael Jordan, the kid who wanted to play basketball. He was Michael Jordan, the icon, the mogul, the one whose every move was scrutinized by the world. He reached the outskirts of Wilmington and found himself driving toward the small park where he used to play basketball with his brothers and friends. He hadn't been back here since his early years in the NBA, and even then, he hadn't stayed long. There was always something pulling him forward, toward the next game, the next challenge, the next win. The park looked different now, a few more trees, the playground equipment worn and faded. But the court, though weathered, still stood. It wasn't much more than cracked pavement and a rusty hoop, but to Jordan, it was a symbol of something much more significant. It was where it all began. The feeling of the ball bouncing against the concrete, the sound of sneakers squeaking on the pavement, he remembered those sounds like it was yesterday. He pulled the car over to the side and stepped out. The park was empty, save for a few kids on the playground. He walked over to the court, his shoes crunching against the gravel as he approached. The hoop was still there, although it had seen better days. The backboard was cracked, the net had long since fallen away, and the lines on the court were barely visible. But to Jordan, it was perfect. He walked slowly to the free throw line, imagining the countless hours he had spent shooting baskets here. It wasn't about competition back then, it was about escaping, about finding something that felt like home. Basketball had been his refuge, the place where he could push himself, where he could lose himself in the rhythm of the game. It wasn't about the world watching or the trophies at the end of the season, it was about the joy of playing, the joy of getting better. The breeze stirred the trees around the park, and for a moment, it was as if time had stopped. Jordan closed his eyes and remembered what it had felt like to be that kid, standing here alone, practicing shot after shot, imagining what it would be like to one day be great. He thought of all the sacrifices his family had made to support his dreams, the long nights his parents had spent driving him to games, to practices, to tournaments. They had believed in him, even when he had doubted himself. They had seen the potential he hadn't yet realized. He couldn't help but feel a pang of regret, not for the choices he had made, but for how far removed he had become from those simple, unencumbered days. A soft chuckle escaped his lips as he took one last look at the court. It's funny, he thought to himself, how it all starts here, and you never really realize how much you leave behind until you come back. As he turned to walk back to the car, the weight of the years seemed to settle on him. The path he had taken had been filled with success, but it had also been a path of loneliness, of sacrifices, of moments he could never get back. The world had celebrated his victories, but the quiet moments, the ones that had shaped him into the man he was, were now fading into the background, lost in the blur of fame and achievement. Jordan sat back in his car, starting the engine, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the usual rush to move on to the next thing. He just sat there, in the stillness of the moment, allowing himself to feel everything that had been building up inside him. He knew that this trip, this return to Wilmington, had opened a door he hadn't expected. And he wasn't sure what he would find on the other side, but for the first time in years, he felt like it was okay to not have all the answers. As he drove away, the park in his rearview mirror, Jordan knew that his journey had come full circle. What had started as a small-town dream had turned into a legacy beyond anything he had ever imagined. But here, in Wilmington, standing on the same cracked court where it had all begun, he realized that the most important things, the things that had driven him to succeed, were the very things he had almost forgotten. And now, at this point in his life, he was ready to face them again. As Michael Jordan continued to drive through Wilmington, he found himself reflecting on how much had changed. The town had always been a place of humble beginnings, a place that had shaped him into who he became. But as he revisited the places that once held so much meaning for him, he couldn't help but notice how those places had transformed, how they no longer felt familiar. The streets, once filled with the noise of childhood play, were now quiet, empty. The homes had been replaced with empty lots, the playgrounds now neglected. His childhood neighborhood was slowly disappearing, just as so much of his past had faded with time. There was a strange heaviness in his chest as he drove through the streets, and he tried to shake it off. After all, he had done it. He had achieved everything he had set out to do. He had become an icon, a symbol of success, of greatness. The world had seen him at his best, celebrated his achievements, and lauded him for his unwavering commitment to winning. He had lived a life few could ever imagine, and he had come out on top. But now, as he revisited these familiar places, it was hard not to feel like something had been lost along the way. It wasn't just the houses that were gone, it was the sense of simplicity, the connection to a time when he had played for the pure joy of the game, when basketball had been a way to escape, a way to be himself, before the world's expectations had shaped him into something else. As he reached the end of the street, Jordan pulled over to the curb. He parked the car and sat there for a while, just looking at the scene before him. It was almost like a dream, a place that felt distant, though it was only a short drive from where he had started. The house that had been his home, the place where he had spent his childhood, was gone. And with it, so much of what had driven him in those early days. It had been here, on these streets, that he had first felt the pull to be great. It had been on this very court that he had learned how to overcome adversity, how to face rejection and turn it into motivation. He thought about those early years, when he wasn't yet the Michael Jordan the world would come to know. Back then, he had been just a kid, trying to prove himself, trying to find his place in a world that had no idea what was to come. But the world knew now. He had conquered basketball, built an empire, and set records that seemed unreachable. He had won championships, become a cultural icon, and transcended the game in a way few ever could. He had been lauded for his work ethic, his competitive fire, and his unmatched ability to perform under pressure. The media had praised him, fans had worshipped him, and his name had become synonymous with success. He had become a symbol of perseverance, of pushing through any obstacle to reach the top. Yet, standing here in his old neighborhood, with the memory of those simpler days surrounding him, Jordan felt a sense of longing for something more. There was a quiet ache inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The fame, the trophies, the accolades, they were all incredible, but they didn't fill the void. He realized that he had spent so much time striving for greatness, striving to be the best, that he had lost sight of why he started in the first place. Basketball had been his passion, his escape, but somewhere along the way, it had become a business, a race for titles, a relentless pursuit of validation. He had achieved everything he ever wanted, but at what cost? He thought back to the days when he had played basketball in his backyard, when he had practiced shot after shot, dreaming of what could be. Those were the moments that had fueled him, not the endorsement deals or the championship rings. Those early years had shaped him, made him hungry, but also innocent. Back then, basketball had been about personal growth, not the weight of expectations. It had been a way to escape from the pressures of life, a way to focus on something he could control. But now, with all the success he had achieved, Jordan realized that he had lost that part of himself. The drive, the hunger, it was still there, but it had become tangled up with the demands of fame and the pressures of being the greatest. He had spent so many years chasing that next championship, that next victory, that he had forgotten what it had been like to simply love the game for the game's sake. Jordan closed his eyes and let out a deep breath. He had never allowed himself to confront these feelings before. He had always been too focused on the next challenge, the next competition. But now, in this quiet moment, standing in the place where it all began, he couldn't ignore the emptiness that lingered. The thing he had been chasing for so long, the validation, the recognition, had never fully filled him. The hunger to be the best had consumed him, but in the process, it had made him lose sight of the things that had truly mattered. He thought about his family, his friends, the people who had supported him throughout his journey. He thought about his father, who had always been there, pushing him to be better, but also reminding him of the importance of balance. He thought about the early days when he was just another kid with a dream, and how his family had sacrificed so much to help him get to where he was. They had believed in him when he had nothing but a basketball and a dream. But now, even with all that he had achieved, Jordan felt a deep sense of disconnection. He had spent so many years focused on his career that he had neglected the people who had been there for him from the start. Jordan shifted in his seat and stared out the window, watching the kids playing basketball on the park courts nearby. They were laughing, carefree, focused only on the game. He saw a lot of himself in them, the same passion, the same hunger, the same joy in playing the game. It reminded him of when it had been about more than just winning, when it had been about self-expression, about pushing yourself to be better for the love of the game. For the first time in a long time, Jordan felt like he could let go of the pressure. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He had accomplished everything he set out to do, and more. He had transcended the game of basketball, but in doing so, he had almost lost the very thing that had driven him in the first place. Now, standing in front of the empty lot where his childhood home once stood, he realized that it was time to reclaim what he had lost. It was time to reconnect with the passion, the joy, the drive that had fueled him all those years ago. As he started the car and drove away from Wilmington, Jordan knew that this visit had been more than just a return to the past. It had been a wake-up call, a reminder of what had truly mattered all along. The championships, the fame, the legacy, they were important, but they weren't everything. What mattered most was the journey, the people who had supported him along the way, and the love he had for the game that had started it all. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, Michael Jordan felt ready to face whatever came next. He had come full circle, and this time, he was doing it for himself, not for anyone else. And in that realization, he found peace. As Michael Jordan continued to drive away from Wilmington, the weight of his return still pressed heavily on him. The small town that had shaped his childhood, now barely recognizable, had left him with an overwhelming sense of nostalgia, mixed with something else, an emotional void. He had gone back expecting some sort of resolution, some clarity about his past and the path he had taken. What he hadn't anticipated was how much it would stir up, how much it would leave him questioning things he thought he had long understood. Driving back to his hotel, Jordan's mind drifted back to the height of his career, the championships, the global fame, the accolades that had piled up one after another. He had been on top of the world, admired and envied by millions. But now, as he sat in the quiet of his car, the echo of his childhood haunting him, he realized that the very thing that had once driven him, the fierce ambition to prove himself, had come at the expense of his peace of mind. There had always been a fire inside him, a desire to be the best. But what did being the best really mean now? Had it been worth it? He reached his hotel and walked to his room, trying to shake off the feelings that had resurfaced. The events of the day, the trip back to Wilmington, the empty lot where his childhood home once stood, had stirred something deep inside him. He had always been so focused on the future, always chasing the next achievement, that he had never fully allowed himself to reflect on what he had accomplished. And even now, after achieving more than he could have ever dreamed, he was left with a sense of unfulfilled longing. Sitting down on the edge of the bed, Jordan stared out of the window at the city skyline. It was a view he had seen countless times before, but tonight, it felt different. He wasn't sure if it was the emotional toll of revisiting his past, or the realization that so much of his life had been defined by the pursuit of a future that was always just beyond his reach. Perhaps, in all his success, he had lost sight of something important. Or perhaps, he had just never truly stopped to appreciate what he had already built. The drive back to Wilmington had been quiet, just the hum of the engine and the occasional passing car on the highway. As he passed by the familiar landmarks, he had tried to relive the memories of his childhood, of the times he had spent shooting hoops in his driveway, of the days when basketball was just a game. But now, those memories felt distant, almost unreachable. The sense of joy he had once felt was clouded by the weight of his career, the relentless drive to be the best. He had spent so much time chasing external validation that he hadn't noticed how much it had drained him internally. Jordan had always said that the key to success was believing in yourself, pushing past your limits, and never settling for less than your best. It was a philosophy that had served him well throughout his career, but standing there in Wilmington, looking at the empty lot, he realized that he hadn't fully understood the cost of that philosophy. It had driven him to greatness, yes, but it had also driven him away from the things that truly mattered: family, friendships, and even himself. The thought of his family made him pause. He thought of his mother and father, how they had supported him through everything, always reminding him to stay grounded, to never lose sight of who he was. His father, especially, had been a constant source of strength. He had taught him the importance of hard work and humility, but had also shown him the value of taking time for the things that mattered. Yet, in his pursuit of greatness, Jordan had neglected the lessons his parents had tried to instill in him. He had given so much of himself to the game, to the world, that there were times when he forgot the very people who had helped shape him into the person he had become. The strain of his success had taken a toll on his relationships. There had been moments when he had pushed people away, too focused on his next goal to appreciate the people who had stood by him all along. In the end, it wasn't the championships that would define his legacy, it was the relationships he had built, or failed to build, that would endure. The memory of his father's passing returned to him now, and with it, the quiet ache that had never fully gone away. His father had been more than just a parent to him. He had been his mentor, his guide, his greatest supporter. And when he passed away, Michael had felt like a part of himself had died with him. In the years that followed, Jordan had returned to the game with an even greater sense of urgency, determined to honor his father's memory by achieving everything he had dreamed of. But what had that urgency cost him? The phone on the bedside table buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He picked it up and saw that it was an old friend from his days at UNC. The friend had been part of the team that had helped him to his first taste of success, and now, years later, they were reconnecting. The message was simple, but it struck Jordan deeply. You ever stop and look at everything you've done? You ever just take a moment to breathe and appreciate it? He sat back, looking at the screen. The question was simple enough, but it was one he had never really asked himself. He had always been moving forward, always chasing the next challenge. But now, as he sat in his hotel room, feeling the weight of his past and present collide, he realized how little he had truly stopped to appreciate what he had accomplished. He had won 6 NBA championships, changed the game of basketball, and built a legacy that would last long after he was gone. But did that make him happy? Did it fill the emptiness that had been gnawing at him for years? Jordan picked up the phone and typed out a message in response. Maybe it's time to stop chasing and start reflecting. The reply came back almost immediately. It's about time, man. You've earned it. As he set the phone down, Jordan realized that the past few days had given him something he hadn't expected, a sense of clarity. The drive, the ambition, the need to be the best, those things had gotten him to where he was, but they had also kept him from fully experiencing life as it came. It was time to change that. He wasn't sure how yet, but the first step was clear. He needed to reconnect with himself, with the things that had mattered most before the world had placed its expectations on him. The trip to Wilmington, the visit to his old home, had unlocked something inside him. It was as if he had finally allowed himself to grieve what had been lost, to accept the fact that the pursuit of perfection had come at a cost. But in doing so, he had also allowed himself to appreciate everything he had achieved, not just as an athlete, but as a man. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were things he would never get back. But now, he was ready to find peace with the man he had become. With a deep breath, Jordan stood up and walked to the window. The city outside was still and quiet, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. It was time to stop chasing, to stop running from his past, and to start living in the moment. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. What mattered was how he chose to move forward, from this point, with clarity, with intention, and with the understanding that sometimes, the greatest victory is simply finding peace within yourself. As the night settled in, Jordan finally closed his eyes, knowing that his journey was far from over. But for the first time in years, he was ready to embrace it, not as the icon, not as the champion, but as Michael. And that, he realized, was enough. Michael Jordan sat back in his hotel room, a deep sense of contemplation settling over him. The city lights outside cast a dim glow through the curtains, but it was the quiet in the room that felt louder than anything else. It was as though the stillness had given him a chance to finally exhale, to let go of the constant pressure he had lived with for so long. Everything had always been about achieving more, getting better, becoming the best, winning the next game, the next championship, the next accolade. It had been that way for decades, and in many ways, it still felt natural. But tonight, after his return to Wilmington, things had shifted. He no longer felt like the man who was always striving, always pushing forward with no end in sight. The journey of his career had been a relentless chase, one that he had embraced fully. He had gone from a local high school kid, left out and doubted, to an international icon whose name was known in every corner of the globe. Basketball had been the vehicle for his escape, his expression, his fight against the world's expectations. But now, in this quiet moment, as he sat by himself in his hotel room, Michael began to question what it had all meant. Had the relentless pursuit of greatness really been worth the toll it had taken on him? He had spent so many years chasing the next victory, the next challenge, that he hadn't stopped to think about the life he had built outside of basketball. He thought back to the conversations he had had with friends, coaches, and family over the years. People had always said he was driven, perhaps to an obsessive degree. But in the past, he had worn that label with pride. He was Michael Jordan, the unstoppable force, the man who wouldn't rest until he was on top. He had built that identity, and the world had embraced it. But what did it really mean, now? What had he gained from all of it, beyond the trophies and the headlines? Sitting there, Michael thought of his family, his mother, his brothers, his wife. He thought of his children, and of the moments he had missed, the birthdays, the milestones. The career that had defined him had also kept him from being fully present in the lives of those who mattered most. It wasn't just the endless hours spent in the gym, the countless flights, or the media appearances. It was the mental space he had given to the game, to the public, and to his own sense of needing to be perfect. His family had always been there for him, but he had failed to truly be there for them, and that weighed on him now. He thought about his father, who had been a guiding force in his life. His father had always told him that it was important to chase his dreams, to push forward, but also to remember what really mattered. It was advice that Jordan had heard, but at times had struggled to internalize. As he sat alone, contemplating the years behind him, he realized that he had lost sight of the very things his father had tried to instill in him. Family, love, and connection, they had taken a back seat to the ambition, to the hunger to be the best, to the drive that had pushed him to heights few ever reached. The emptiness of the hotel room seemed to mirror the emptiness he had been feeling inside. He had everything anyone could want: money, fame, recognition, success, but there was something missing. He had spent so many years focusing on becoming the best that he hadn't stopped to check in with the person who was behind all of it. Michael Jordan, the man, the father, the husband, the son. For the first time in years, he was beginning to understand that it wasn't just about basketball. It was about being a whole person, and he had been so focused on the game that he had neglected everything else. As the night grew deeper, he found himself picking up his phone. He thought about calling his mother, or perhaps one of his kids, but instead, he found himself scrolling through old photos of his family, of friends, of teammates. There were moments captured in those pictures that he had forgotten, moments of joy and laughter, of camaraderie and connection. As he looked at the faces, at the memories frozen in time, he realized how much he had missed by being so consumed by the chase. The game had taken so much from him, but it had also given him something precious: relationships, experiences, people who had shaped him into who he was. It was time to reconnect with those people, to appreciate them while he still could. Jordan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, and for the first time, it felt like he was seeing himself clearly. The face that had become so familiar to the world, etched with the lines of time, with the scars of a lifetime of competition, was still his own, but it was also different. The young boy from Wilmington was still inside him, but now, he was a man who had lived through years of struggle, triumph, and sacrifice. He had done what he set out to do. He had become the best. But what did it all mean if he hadn't taken the time to truly live? As he stood there, staring into the reflection, Jordan understood something important. Greatness wasn't just about winning. It wasn't about titles or records or adoration. Greatness was about the way you lived, the way you treated people, the way you showed up for the ones you loved. His legacy was not just in the 6 NBA championships, the MVPs, the Hall of Fame honors. It was in the people he had influenced, the children he had mentored, the lives he had touched along the way. He made a decision in that moment, a quiet vow to himself. It was time to reconnect with those who mattered most, to step away from the spotlight, and to focus on being present, on being Michael Jordan, not the icon, but the person. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, that it would take time, but it was a journey he was ready to take. The next day, as Jordan prepared to leave Wilmington and head back to Chicago, he took one last look at the places that had shaped him. He realized that his return had been the first step toward something new, something deeper. It wasn't about running away from the past or forgetting the journey that had brought him here. It was about understanding it, accepting it, and moving forward with a clearer sense of purpose. Jordan boarded the plane back to Chicago with a new resolve. There were things that had been lost, things he couldn't get back, but there were also new opportunities on the horizon. This chapter of his life was not just about basketball. It was about his legacy as a whole, his family, his community, and the impact he had made on the world. He was ready to embrace the next chapter, not as the athlete he had once been, but as the man he had become. As the plane soared through the sky, Jordan sat back in his seat, his mind at ease for the first time in a long while. He had found something in Wilmington that he had been searching for, something that had eluded him for years. And now, with that newfound clarity, he was ready to face the future with open arms, knowing that the greatest victory was not just in what you accomplish, but in who you become along the way. The flight back to Chicago felt different this time. Michael Jordan sat quietly, his seat reclined slightly, staring out the window at the clouded sky below. The hum of the plane was soothing, but his mind was far from peaceful. The events of the last few days kept replaying in his head, the trip to Wilmington, standing in front of his childhood home, revisiting memories he had long buried. It was more than just a visit. It had been a revelation, a moment of reckoning that made him confront things he had never allowed himself to address in the rush of his career. He had always known that basketball had been his life, his driving force, his escape, and his greatest achievement. But in the quiet of Wilmington, where the pressures of the world didn't reach him, he had allowed himself to reflect on something he had overlooked for so long. He had spent decades chasing perfection, constantly trying to prove something to the world. But now, he realized that the true measure of his life wasn't the number of championships, MVPs, or accolades he had won. It was the people he had impacted, the relationships he had built, and the moments of quiet personal growth that had been overshadowed by his public persona. Jordan exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the armrest. He thought about his family, his mother, his brothers, his children. He thought about the years he had spent away from them, the time he had sacrificed to build his career. The more he reflected, the more he understood how little he had truly been there for them. The game had consumed him, and in doing so, it had created a distance between him and the people who mattered most. There had been no balance, no time to breathe, to be present. He had been so focused on the goal that he had neglected the simple joys of life, family dinners, holidays, quiet afternoons at home. The memory of his father, especially, lingered. His father had been his rock, his biggest supporter, and his most trusted mentor. He had been the one person who always reminded him to stay grounded, to appreciate the small things. When his father passed away, Michael had felt the world shift under his feet. He poured himself into basketball, as if that could somehow fill the void left behind. But it never did. The more he won, the emptier he felt. The more he chased greatness, the more he realized that what he was really searching for was something deeper, something more lasting than fame or recognition. As the plane descended toward Chicago, the bustling city coming into view, Jordan's thoughts shifted. He had already made up his mind that things had to change. He couldn't continue living in the shadow of his own legacy, constantly fighting to uphold an image that no longer reflected who he truly was. The journey to Wilmington had opened his eyes to the fact that there was more to life than basketball. There was more to his legacy than just the trophies and endorsements. He needed to reconnect with himself, to find peace with who he had become, and to rebuild the relationships he had let slip away in the pursuit of success. The plane touched down, and the steady hum of the engines faded as he gathered his things and made his way off the aircraft. The weight of the moment didn't lift immediately. He was still processing everything, still unsure of what the next steps would be. But as he walked through the airport terminal, he felt a new sense of determination. It wasn't the same hunger to prove himself that had fueled him in his younger days. This was different. It was a quieter, more reflective kind of resolve, a desire to live a life that was balanced, a life that honored the lessons he had learned along the way. Back in Chicago, Jordan returned to his home, the familiar surroundings of his mansion offering little comfort. His children were away with their mother, and the house felt empty. It was easy to get lost in the silence, to let the weight of his thoughts consume him. But instead of retreating into the familiar rhythms of his life, endless meetings, media appearances, and business ventures, he decided to take a different approach. He reached out to his family, to the people who had always been there for him but whom he had neglected in the rush of his career. The first call he made was to his mother. Her voice, warm and familiar, felt like a lifeline. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Michael, it's so good to hear from you. How are you, honey?" He smiled, though she couldn't see it. "I'm good. Just thinking a lot, you know?" "Thinking about what?" "I've been doing a lot of reflecting lately, about everything. About life, about the game, about us." His mother's voice was steady, calm. "What are you realizing, Michael?" "I've realized I've been chasing the wrong things. I've spent so much time focusing on what the world wants from me that I've forgotten what's important. I've forgotten about the things that made me happy before all of this, before basketball, before the fame, before everything." His mother was quiet for a moment. "You've always been driven, Michael. I know that. But don't forget that you're more than just the game. You've always been more." "I know, Mom. And that's what I've been trying to figure out. I've been so focused on winning, on being the best, that I've lost touch with who I really am. With who I really want to be." "Well, it's not too late," she said, her voice warm with encouragement. "You're still here, Michael. You're still breathing. And there's always time to start over." His heart softened as he listened to her words. She had always been there for him, always believed in him, even when he had doubts about himself. And now, after everything, she was reminding him of what he had almost forgotten, the importance of family, of love, of being true to yourself. "I've been thinking about coming down to visit," Jordan said. "Spend some time with you, just reconnect." "I'd like that," his mother replied, a hint of emotion in her voice. "I've missed you." As the conversation ended, Jordan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had taken the first step in making things right. There was no magic fix, no quick answer to the questions that had been lingering for so long. But reaching out to his family, reconnecting with the people who had supported him, felt like the right place to start. He had spent so many years striving for perfection, but now, he realized, the real victory was in the relationships, the connections that grounded him. Over the next few days, Jordan reached out to others, old friends, former teammates, people who had been part of his life but whom he had drifted away from. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that it was time to rebuild. He wanted to reconnect with the people who had been with him through the highs and lows, the ones who had known him before the fame, before the legend. As he continued to take these steps, Jordan found a new sense of purpose. It wasn't about basketball anymore. It wasn't about proving something to the world. It was about living a life that was full, not just of accomplishments, but of love, of connections, of memories that could never be erased. He didn't know where this new journey would take him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The past had shaped him, but it didn't have to define him. It was time to create a new legacy, one that was based on balance, on peace, and on the things that truly mattered. And as he stepped into this new chapter of his life, Michael Jordan knew that he was finally ready to face it, not as the icon, but as the man he had always been. The days following Michael Jordan's realization about the balance he had been missing in his life felt surreal. For years, he had been living in the echo of his own myth, the relentless champion, the basketball god, the ultimate competitor. But now, after years of chasing the next victory, the next title, the next endorsement deal, he felt like he was finally waking up from a long, exhausting dream. He wasn't sure where to begin, or how to change the course of his life after everything that had happened, but there was a clarity he had never felt before. It had started with the phone call to his mother, and then the call to an old teammate. Slowly, the pieces of his life began to fall into place. The floodgates of emotion had been opened when he had stood in front of his childhood home in Wilmington, and those feelings hadn't faded. If anything, they had only deepened, compelling him to reassess his entire existence, not just as a former athlete but as a person, a father, a son, a friend. He had spent countless hours alone with his thoughts in his hotel room in Wilmington, and now, back in Chicago, those thoughts had begun to crystallize. He was ready to reconnect, to rebuild what had been broken, or at least neglected, over the years. He had started the process by reaching out to his family, the ones who had been there for him when he didn't have anything else. But now, it was time to extend that reach. The fans, the media, the world, they had seen the public figure of Michael Jordan, the basketball superstar. But few had ever seen the private Michael, the person who had grown up here, who had faced rejection, failure, and loneliness. Jordan had realized that for most of his career, he had been chasing validation, recognition, approval from others. He had been conditioned to believe that only through relentless achievement would he be complete. But now he understood that what really mattered wasn't the victories, but the relationships he had left behind in the pursuit of them. The next few weeks were a blur of calls, visits, and moments of reconnecting. He went to see his mother in North Carolina, spending days just talking, reflecting, and laughing about old memories. It wasn't about anything grand or monumental, it was about the simple act of being present. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the pressure to perform, to be the greatest. He was simply Michael, the son who had left and was now coming home in more ways than one. He also made it a point to reach out to old friends and teammates. He visited old coaches, catching up with those who had helped shape him into the player he had become. It wasn't about apologies or excuses, it was about acknowledgement. He wanted them to know that, after all the years of being defined by the game, he had finally begun to understand what truly mattered. One of the visits that meant the most to him was with Scottie Pippen. They had been more than just teammates, they had been brothers on the court, battling together through the highs and lows of their careers. Over the years, their relationship had been tested by the pressures of the game, by misunderstandings, and the weight of being part of a dynasty. But when Jordan called Pippen to meet up, he felt a sense of gratitude that he had never fully appreciated before. They met in a quiet cafe, away from the noise of Chicago, just the two of them sitting down, facing each other like they had many times before. "Man, it's been a while," Scottie said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I know," Jordan replied, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about the old days lately." "I think we both have," Scottie responded, his eyes reflecting the same sense of nostalgia. The conversation shifted from basketball to life. They talked about the challenges they had both faced, how their careers had shaped them, and how time had changed things. There was no bitterness, no unfinished business between them. Instead, there was a shared understanding, a recognition that their bond had been forged in something deeper than basketball. "Remember when we used to stay up late, talking about how much we wanted to win? How much we wanted to be remembered?" Jordan said, leaning back in his chair. "I used to think that was everything. But I see things differently now. It wasn't just the victories. It was the way we pushed each other, the way we made each other better. That's what really mattered." Scottie nodded. "Yeah. I think we both learned a lot about ourselves through that journey." "I know I did." There was a quiet pause between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of mutual respect, of understanding that the years of competition had been part of something bigger than just the game itself. Jordan had spent so many years obsessed with being the best that he had never fully appreciated the team aspect, the camaraderie, the shared goals, the sacrifices made by those around him. He had been so focused on his own journey that he hadn't always seen the journey of others. But now, he understood that it was the relationships, the connections with others, that had made the whole experience worthwhile. As they parted ways, Jordan felt a sense of relief wash over him. It was as if a weight had been lifted. The journey to understanding his own legacy, his own identity, was far from over, but it was a journey that had to be made one step at a time. In the following days, Jordan continued to make changes in his life. He spent more time with his family, with his children, being present in ways he had never been able to before. He called up old friends who had fallen by the wayside and made an effort to reconnect with people who had once been important to him. It was the start of something new, something more intentional. He was no longer Michael Jordan, the legend. He was Michael Jordan, the man who had realized the importance of balance, of remembering what had truly mattered. His reflection on his past led him to make one final decision. He had spent years building his business empire, but now he felt compelled to give more of himself back. His charity work, which had been overshadowed by his fame, suddenly took on new meaning. He worked with his foundation to increase its impact, focusing on providing opportunities for underprivileged children to experience the same joy he had found in basketball. It was no longer about being remembered for his greatness. It was about giving others the chance to find their own path to success, to create their own legacy. And through it all, Jordan found peace. The game had been his life, but it was no longer the only thing that defined him. He had built a legacy, but that legacy was more than just titles. It was about the people who had shaped him, the experiences that had taught him, and the understanding that greatness wasn't just about winning. It was about how you made others feel, how you impacted their lives, and how you gave something of yourself to the world. In the quiet moments of reflection, Jordan finally understood that the greatest victory of all was not on the basketball court, but in the way you lived your life, how you loved, how you connected, and how you left a mark on the world that would last far longer than any championship. And for the first time in years, Michael Jordan was content with the man he had become. As Michael Jordan spent more time reflecting on the past, the clarity he had gained from his trip to Wilmington only deepened. The decision to reconnect with his roots, his family, his old friends, the places where it all began, had ignited something in him. It wasn't just about reliving memories or correcting mistakes. It was about understanding himself, the man behind the icon, and coming to terms with the complexities of his journey. He spent more time with his family in the months following his return from Wilmington, intentionally making space for them in his life. The meetings and events he once prioritized took a back seat, and slowly, he felt himself becoming more present, more grounded. The demands of fame and business were still there, but his understanding of what mattered most had shifted. Time spent with his children became sacred. For the first time in years, he wasn't simply a father in the background, he was actively engaged, listening, sharing, and just being there for them. His relationship with his mother also deepened. Over the years, their bond had been that of a son's gratitude for all she had done to support him, but in the months following his return, they began to share more than just surface-level conversation. Jordan realized how much his mother had sacrificed, how much she had carried alone during his rise to fame. She had been a steadfast presence, but he hadn't always seen her for who she was, a woman with her own dreams, her own struggles. Now, they talked for hours, about everything from basketball to life's greatest lessons. He had learned that the unconditional support she had given him was rooted in a deep understanding of what mattered most, family, love, and strength. But it wasn't just his family that he began to focus on. He reached out to old teammates, those who had been by his side through the highs and lows of his career. He called up players like Steve Kerr, Ron Harper, and others who had contributed to his championship runs but had often been overshadowed by his fame. The relationships he had formed with his teammates were crucial to his success, and yet, over the years, he had become so fixated on his own image that he had neglected the importance of those bonds. When he spoke with his former teammates, they shared stories, laughed about old games, and talked about the challenges of being part of such a high-profile team. It wasn't about reliving the glory days, it was about the shared journey they had taken together, the camaraderie that had fueled their victories. One afternoon, Jordan sat down with his former coach, Phil Jackson. The conversation began casually, but soon it turned deeper. They discussed the pressures of leadership, the challenge of guiding a team full of superstars, and the unique dynamics that made the Bulls' success possible. Jackson, always a patient listener, acknowledged Jordan's desire to be the best, but he also reminded him of something crucial. Greatness didn't come from striving for perfection, it came from embracing the flaws, the imperfections, the vulnerability that made a team strong. Jordan realized that in his quest for perfection, he had sometimes overlooked the human side of the game. He had been driven by an almost obsessive need to win, but he had forgotten that the real magic of those championships had been in the unity of the team, the way they had supported one another, flaws and all. As Jordan spent time with those who had been close to him, he felt a growing sense of gratitude. These were the people who had shaped his life, his family, his friends, his teammates. The realization struck him that while success in basketball had brought him fame and recognition, it was these relationships that had truly defined his legacy. It wasn't just about the 6 NBA championships, the iconic game-winning shots, or the international acclaim. It was about the people who had stood by him, who had helped him grow, who had challenged him to be better. These relationships were the foundation of everything he had achieved. But while Jordan found peace in reconnecting with others, there was still a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling of having missed out. He thought about the years he had spent away from home, constantly on the road, always chasing the next victory. He thought about his own childhood, about how much he had wanted to escape, to make a name for himself, to prove that he was more than just a kid from Wilmington. But what had that drive cost him? Had it cost him his peace? Had it cost him his ability to truly live in the moment? It was during a quiet evening at home, when his family was gathered around the dinner table, that Jordan had his breakthrough moment. He was sitting back, listening to his children talk about their day, when it hit him, he was exactly where he needed to be. For years, he had measured his success by external standards, the number of trophies, the amount of money, the level of fame. But now, sitting in the warmth of his home, surrounded by the people who mattered most, he understood that the true measure of success was not in what the world thought of him, but in how he had shown up for the people he loved. That night, as the conversation shifted from lighthearted jokes to deeper discussions about life and dreams, Jordan found himself genuinely present. For once, he wasn't thinking about his legacy or his next business venture. He was just enjoying the time he had with his family, with the people who had been with him through thick and thin. It wasn't about being the best in the world anymore. It was about being the best he could be for them. The shift in perspective was profound. Jordan began to realize that the true power of his legacy lay in the way he had touched people's lives. It wasn't about the fame or the fortune, it was about the influence he had had on others, the way he had inspired a generation of athletes, and the way he had led by example, even in moments of struggle. He had always believed that his worth was defined by his achievements, but now, he understood that his legacy was about the impact he had on others. It was about how he made them feel, how he encouraged them to pursue their dreams, and how he had helped them believe that anything was possible. He also began to see the importance of vulnerability. For so long, he had prided himself on his ability to push through pain, to overcome obstacles, and to never show weakness. But in reconnecting with his past, with the people who had known him before the fame, he had learned that true strength came not from hiding one's struggles, but from embracing them. The moments of failure, the times when he had fallen short, had been just as important as his victories. They had taught him resilience, humility, and the value of perseverance. He realized that his greatest triumphs weren't the ones the world had celebrated. They were the quiet moments, the ones where he had picked himself up, kept going, and learned to be better. As the months went on, Jordan continued to live with a renewed sense of purpose. He spent more time with his children, took on new business ventures that aligned with his personal values, and deepened his relationships with old friends and teammates. He became more involved in philanthropy, focusing on causes that were close to his heart, especially initiatives aimed at providing opportunities for young people. He wasn't just a basketball player anymore, he was a mentor, a father, a business leader, and, most importantly, a man who had come to understand that life was about more than just winning. It was about living fully, embracing the journey, and making an impact that would last far beyond the court. And so, as Michael Jordan looked back on his career, he no longer saw it as a pursuit of perfection. He saw it as a series of moments, some triumphant, some challenging, that had shaped him into the person he had become. His legacy was not just in the records he had set, but in the lives he had touched, the people he had inspired, and the way he had learned to embrace both his strengths and his flaws. As Michael Jordan stood in front of the mirror one morning, gazing at the reflection that had become so familiar over the years, he realized that the man looking back at him wasn't the same as the one who had first picked up a basketball all those years ago. His face had aged, his hair showing traces of gray, his body no longer as lean or spry as it once was. But despite the years, the changes, and the losses, there was something unmistakably the same about him: the fire, the competitive spirit, the drive to be better than he had been the day before. But this time, that drive had shifted. The intensity was still there, but it wasn't fueled by the same relentless desire to prove himself to the world. Now, it was about understanding, about embracing the process of living, not just chasing the next title, but finding peace with the journey. It wasn't about running from his past anymore. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward with a new sense of clarity. He had spent years running, trying to outrun his failures, his doubts, and the pressure of being the best. The constant demand for greatness had been exhausting, but the hardest part had been the loneliness that came with it. In the quiet moments, away from the cameras and the fans, Jordan had felt the weight of it all. It wasn't just the exhaustion from the physical demands of basketball. It was the emotional toll of always having to be perfect, of always having to maintain the image that the world had created for him. But over the past few months, as he had spent more time with his family, his friends, and those who had known him before the fame, he had found something different. He had found connection. Real connection, not the kind of superficial relationships that came with being a celebrity, but the kind that grounded him. He realized that in his quest for validation, he had neglected the most important thing: his relationships, his love for the people around him, and the simple pleasures of life. He had focused so much on what the world expected from him that he had lost touch with what he expected from himself. He thought about the times he had spent away from his family, the moments when his children had grown up without him by their side. He thought about the relationships he had allowed to slip away because he was too busy winning, too busy being the best. He had built an empire, yes. But what had it all meant if he had missed out on the simple joys of living? He had been so consumed by the drive for success, the need to prove something, that he had lost sight of the things that truly made life worth living. But now, as he looked in the mirror, he knew that he was finally ready to make a change. He wasn't going to erase the past, he didn't want to. The successes, the struggles, the victories, and the defeats were all part of his journey. But he was ready to stop running from the things that had been haunting him. It was time to reconnect with what had always mattered: family, love, and the ability to live fully in the present. He remembered the conversations he had had with his mother, with his father before he passed, and with his children. They had all said the same thing: life was about more than just chasing victories. It was about the moments in between. The moments of laughter, of quiet reflection, of connection. The moments that didn't make the headlines but were the foundation of everything else. It was those moments that he had been missing, and he was ready to reclaim them. The shift in his perspective didn't happen overnight. It wasn't as if one day he simply woke up and everything was different. It was gradual, a slow understanding that the things he had been chasing for so long didn't hold the same weight as they once did. The constant pursuit of greatness had been a way to distract himself from the deeper truths about who he was and what he wanted. And now, he was ready to face those truths. Jordan made a conscious effort to spend more time with his family. He invited his children to spend weekends with him, away from the media, away from the distractions. They played basketball together, yes, but it wasn't about keeping score. It was about simply being together. The time they spent outdoors, talking, laughing, sharing stories, was what he had missed. He realized that being there for his children, being present in their lives, was far more important than any game he had ever played. He also reconnected with friends he hadn't spoken to in years. He reached out to some of his former teammates, just to catch up, to talk about life beyond basketball. He wasn't interested in reminiscing about old victories or discussing past games. He just wanted to know how they were doing, how their families were, what they had learned since their time together on the court. In those conversations, Jordan realized that the bond they shared had always been more than basketball. It had been about mutual respect, about the shared experience of working toward a common goal, and about understanding each other's struggles and triumphs. It wasn't about being the greatest, it was about being human. As the months passed, Michael Jordan found himself attending more family events, sitting down for quiet dinners with his children, and taking part in community events that allowed him to connect with people on a deeper level. He also became more involved in charitable work. He wasn't doing it for the publicity or the recognition. He was doing it because he had found purpose in giving back and using his platform to make a positive impact on others' lives. He realized that he didn't need to keep proving himself. He had already done that. He had proven that he could be the best, that he could dominate on the court. But now, it was about something else. It was about finding fulfillment in the moments that mattered most, in the relationships he had nurtured, and in the people he could help. Through this process, Jordan started to feel a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. It wasn't about slowing down or retreating from the world. It was about embracing a new phase of life, one that was focused on balance and connection rather than achievement and perfection. He didn't have to keep striving for something external. He had already built a legacy. Now, it was time to focus on the internal journey, on being present, being content, and being connected to the people he loved. As he continued to adjust to this new mindset, Jordan realized that the ultimate goal of life wasn't to be the best in the world, but to be the best version of yourself. It was about making peace with who you are and embracing the parts of yourself that had been shaped by both success and failure. He had been the greatest basketball player the world had ever seen, but now, he understood that greatness wasn't just about winning games, it was about living authentically, with love, humility, and gratitude. Michael Jordan had spent his life chasing victory, but now, he had found something even more valuable, a sense of peace with who he had become and a renewed commitment to the things that truly mattered. He wasn't just Michael Jordan, the legend. He was Michael Jordan, the man. And that was enough. As the sun began to set over Chicago, Michael Jordan sat on his porch, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He had spent the day with his children, playing basketball, talking, just enjoying each other's company. The days of being caught up in the whirlwind of his career seemed so far behind him now, almost like another life entirely. It wasn't that the past didn't matter, it had shaped him, after all, but now, he could finally see it all with a sense of peace. The relentless chase for greatness, the fame, the triumphs, and the losses, they all had a place in his story, but they no longer defined him. For so many years, the world had known him as a basketball legend, the ultimate competitor who never stopped striving for perfection. But now, as he sat on that porch with his children, the weight of those expectations felt lighter. He had become a man who had not only accepted his past but had learned to appreciate the simple moments that made life meaningful. He had spent so much of his life focused on what he hadn't yet achieved, but now, he could see that it was the love and connection he had nurtured that mattered most. The house he sat in now was the one he had built, the home that his children had grown up in. It was different from the childhood home in Wilmington, but in its own way, it had come to symbolize the life he had worked so hard to create. It wasn't just about the success, the trophies, or the accolades. It was about the foundation he had built for his family, the foundation that had come from the lessons of his past. Jordan had made a decision to live differently, to embrace a life that wasn't dictated by outside expectations but by the things that truly brought him joy. He had spent so many years focused on basketball, on being the best, but now he understood that true success wasn't measured by the number of championships or the size of his empire. It was measured by the people he had around him, the way he had touched their lives, and the way he had taken the time to invest in the relationships that mattered most. The phone rang, breaking the peaceful silence. He glanced down at the screen and saw that it was a familiar number, his old teammate, Scottie Pippen. They had kept in touch, but it had been a while since they had really spoken. Jordan picked up the phone with a smile, knowing that this conversation would be another important step in reconnecting with the past. "Hey, Scotty," Jordan said, his voice warm. "Mike, how's everything?" Scotty's voice came through, casual but with an undercurrent of familiarity. "It's good." "Really good," Jordan replied, leaning back in his chair. "I've been thinking a lot, about everything. About the game, about life, about the years we spent together. It feels like so long ago." "It does," Scotty agreed, his tone softening. "But it was also one of the most important times in both our lives. We did something special, Mike. You know that." Jordan nodded, even though Scotty couldn't see it. "I know, man. I really do. But I think what I've learned more than anything is that it wasn't just the wins that made it special. It was the people. It was the bond we had, the way we pushed each other, the way we were a team. I never realized how much that meant until now." Scotty chuckled. "Yeah, we were a pretty good team, weren't we?" "Yeah, we were," Jordan said, his voice filled with gratitude. "But you know what? I think I took it all for granted. I was so focused on being the best, on winning, that I didn't always appreciate what we had. I didn't always appreciate you, man. And for that, I'm sorry." There was a brief silence on the other end, and Jordan could hear the sincerity in Scotty's response. "It's all right, Mike. We both had our moments, and we both got caught up in the game. But we did what we did because we believed in each other. I think that's the most important thing. You're not just a teammate, Mike. You're a friend. And I've always respected you for that." The conversation continued, each word building on the shared history they had, but also forging a deeper bond between them. They spoke not just of basketball, but of life, of what had come after the game, of their families and the ways they had both grown. It wasn't about revisiting the past to relive the glory days, it was about acknowledging the journey they had taken together, and the journey they were still on. As the call ended, Jordan leaned back in his chair, a deep sense of peace washing over him. He wasn't done with his journey, there was still much to do, still lessons to learn, but he had reached a place where he could finally understand what mattered. It wasn't just the wins, the titles, or the recognition. It was the people who had been there along the way. The ones who had stood by him when the cameras weren't rolling, the ones who had shared in the sacrifices, the ones who had made the journey worthwhile. The sun had fully set now, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. Jordan stood up, walking to the window, looking out at the skyline. There had been times in his life when he had felt like he was chasing something that was just out of reach, something that would make him whole. But now, he understood that the true fulfillment didn't come from external accolades. It came from within, from the way he chose to live his life, from the people he surrounded himself with, and from the impact he had on others. The phone rang again, and this time, it was his daughter. She had grown into a young woman, a college student, and though she wasn't physically at home, their bond had never been stronger. As they talked, he could hear the joy in her voice as they discussed her latest achievements and plans for the future. He was genuinely present in the conversation, listening to her with an open heart, no longer distracted by the weight of his past ambitions. For the first time in years, he felt truly connected, not just to her, but to his life in general. That night, as he lay in bed, Michael Jordan thought about everything he had been through, his rise to fame, his fall, his return, the emotional struggles and triumphs along the way. He had fought for everything, but in doing so, he had learned that there was more to life than the fight. There was peace and acceptance, and understanding that you didn't have to keep running. You didn't have to prove anything to anyone. The game, the records, the titles, those were just parts of a much bigger story. The real story was about love, connection, and legacy. And that was something he had built not just through basketball, but through the people he had shared his life with. The next morning, Jordan woke up early, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. He knew that his work wasn't done, that there was still so much to give. But now, it wasn't about chasing greatness. It was about living with intention, with purpose, and with gratitude. He had built a legacy, not just in the game of basketball, but in the way he lived his life. And as he looked out over the city, Michael Jordan smiled. He had found peace. He had found balance. And in that, he had found the greatest victory of all.